want to get down to sprint level contract planning that says, I'm going to buy by the drink. Right? So companies aren't really willing to think about that because the typical mindset is, no, I want that 5-year deal. What we're trying to tell them is if we are successful and continue to be successful, there's always food on the plate, so to speak.
If I could, let me take you down a little bit of a rat hole. Currently, I have a performance-based contract with the VA, and that is by the number of records I process for claims that come into the VA for soldier, airmen, all the claims that come in. And is it difficult? Yeah, because I have to hire all the people up front. It's harder on the contractor in your situation than it is on the government because we have to hire the people first, and if we're paying by the drink, so we got to have a little cash involvement up front. But I think it's doable. And as I say, I'm doing it right now, and we're doing pretty well. So it also incentivizes us to meet what you're asking us to do and not to drag it down.
There's where I'm going. Right? It's a two-sided incentive.
It is. It's a marriage.
Right. If we make it beneficial to you and you're incentivized to meet our needs, there's more likelihood to be.
I mean, if I perform better, I get a little more money. If I perform worse, I get a little less money. We wrote it that way. The government bought it. So, and I think, what do the contracting officers think? Think it's doable?
I personally do. It just depends on how you like the requirements
Agreed.
up front and what your expectations are and what is the need. I think a lot of the time the problem is we don't know what our exact
We have a hard time.
One thing that they did for me different on this one, I got this under SDVOSP, but the VA sat here, we sat here, the contracting officer sat there, and we actually worked it out. We made our bid, and then we did a contract mod, saying this is the way we're going to perform.
And you can do it that way too. And I think another thing that we need to think about is moving away from the government doing PWS and utilizing a suit and letting the contractor come back with a performance assessment. Especially we're trying to give you a problem and a solution at the same time.
Correct.
If we can do that, then we don't need contractors. That's just
It's also part of that culture shift, right?
It is, yeah.
Folks are very risk averse. Oh, can't do that. Well, try. I mean,
frankly, even from my green suit days up until now, we've grown up that way. The culture is once that PWS step, you don't talk to anybody, or you can't
be crazy,
or you know you give the government 2,000 questions, and now they've got to go answer 2,000 questions that if it were straight before, you wouldn't have to worry about it, right? And I see that burden of those questions to the government that could be totally taken out if there was a conference or something done up front where everybody understood what the requirements were. Again, that's a culture shift.
So one thing to maybe try to get like volume consistency that a lot of offices are looking at award term contracts. So you've heard of a reward fee. I don't know if that's an investigative award term. It means, hey, you perform, here's what you're going to get as far as your future contract, right? So if you consider yourself the best, get volume consistency, and you can go off and hire those people because you're like, hey, we're the best at this. We're going to get all these other award term contracts down the road. So something that people are looking at, and it sounds like in certain areas and pockets, it might not be right for you guys, but it might be something you want to.
Okay. The University of North America program makes sure that all of the IT students understand both Agile and Waterfall approaches and the criticality of effective communications in projects. The critical success factor is creating a culture of information and risk sharing throughout the project. I'm not going to read these to you, but again, what we've already stressed a couple of times, stakeholder involvement early and often, technical rigor and discipline always, agile development, resiliency, and security. I mean, if I could boil down evaluation factors for those 5 things, I think it would put the contractors in a great, we evaluate on a multitude of different things, price and technical ability, but you've really gotten down to those things and we all agree on what those things are. I think you can really get through there. And again, I'll reiterate training and cultural adoption. And again, you see our DevSecOps there as soon as possible. Yeah. Unless somebody has questions, we'll move to the next one.
Well, I'll never get you out of here.
No, we're actually in somebody else's spot. We got time with you guys.
I mean,
We don't have to,
Exactly.
we got 7:30.
Okay, whatever.
I was gonna add one other thing, just back to the culture, in a lot of training programs we've done, especially with the veterans, when you're training while you're working and it's all embedded together, servicemen and women want that sense of purpose, that sense of what I'm doing is matter, kind of answering the why. And I think when you do that and you just create a performance-based culture, kind of one team, one fight, and you have a chance to kind of embed that in the DNA as they come in through the system, I think that's a real important piece of it, especially the younger soldiers that want to know, and I think this is true with all millennials, just don't do your job to do your job. Why am I doing it? Why is it important? Why does it matter? I think that's a huge piece what I've learned in the last 7 years dealing with the transitioning veterans, which are millennials. If you answer the why for them, they'll go to the wall for it. They don't understand the why, and they don't see that sense of purpose, that sense of mission, because they've already been screened out of society. These people are people that want a sense of purpose and mission. If you deliver that as part of the ecosystem, you're much powerful.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, kind of technology, software development pain points. I live through this every day. So,
We all do.
and as Rusty mentioned, we kind of talk about, both waterfall and agile. And so while we tend to migrate as many of the projects as we can towards agile, the reality is that most of the things that we do is some sort of hybrid, right? It's somewhere in between, just because of the fact that, there are stages and maybe you have to do iterations within stages and all this kind of stuff. Especially in something where it's like, there's an actual milestone deliverable fixed price type thing or whatever. And this is where you're getting into like, how do I do these procurements? And there are creative ways that we talked about, like buying by the sprint, maybe measuring by technical debt, customer satisfaction, those other things, as opposed to an actual like, oh, you're going to deliver this widget kind of thing, right? So that's the balancing act that goes there, and that's why we really kind of live a little bit in both worlds. Anything that we do iterate. Okay, so even if we do follow this kind of agile SDLC of like planning, analysis, design, development, or whatever, we're always doing iterations within those pieces, even if there are gates that we move. So what are the main pain points that we basically see, right? So one is requirements, okay? And you guys mentioned it, like I'm inking a 5-year contract or whatever. Like, am I actually going to know the distinct requirements that are going to be 5 years out? So how do we get around these things, and how can Agile help those sorts of things or whatever? So one is making sure that we have the right stakeholders. So you need a product owner, 3-hour playbook, 6. Somebody that basically is in charge and responsible for, defining the product. Okay? And then all the stakeholders for that particular person, right? So that he or she gets the feedback from the users, from management, from the technology staff, from the business staff, from the IT, from security, et cetera, right? So that's really kind of the initial thing. There is the CIO playbook, CIO.gov playbook that we pretty much follow. There's also 12factor.net in any of our software development implementations, right? So those are all best practices that have been kind of endorsed by government in order to basically do these things. So then user-centered design, right? So our end goal is to create working software. And that means that software that users. So I hate to say it, management's very important, but my end goal is to get something in users' hands that are going to make their lives easier and more efficient. So we do a lot of user-centered design, we do a lot of prototyping, and A/B testing, right? And so as you go through these design sprints, right, the whole goal is to basically test those designs before anybody gets any hands-on code, to make sure that you're actually building the right user experience that's going to streamline whatever system you're modernizing, right? And that gets back to, am I designing a new process as opposed to just automating an old system or whatever, okay? Then when you get into basically product development, it's your typical CI/CD pipeline, making sure that your team is working in sprints, making sure that you have test-driven development, all these kinds of things, so that basically you can deploy software. So the goal is that I have production software at the end of any given sprint, right? And I can launch that. Now, whether or not I actually launch that is up to then the product owner, right? Is it a minimum viable product that I can go ahead and launch and then iterate and build on? And our whole goal is to try to get that MVP out as quickly as possible, because the reality is that the difference between Agile and Waterfall is we try to get an MVP out so that it can get out into the hands of the users, and we're actually building based upon feedback, you know, these lean cycles, as opposed to trying to build the entire system at once and finding out, like, we thought they wanted this, but actually now that I got it in the hands of the users, they're not using that functionality, right? That's what makes it more efficient. And then, you know, I think we've mentioned this a lot of times, many of the issues that we run into is because systems are built and we don't take security into account, right? So nothing worse that a CISO wants than a system appears and we're like, oh, go under security review now, because now I need an ANA, right? And they're like, what is this? I haven't even heard of this, right? So what do you want to do? You want to integrate the security in from day one, right? And I talked about kind of the DevSecOps where we're doing the security scanning and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is if we involve the security group from day one, they're actually going to help us make design decisions on the software so that we're building it to their spec, as opposed to building something and then saying, hey, is this, you know, okay for you guys, right? So we get them in, and they're actually part of our sprint planning to say, hey, we're going to use this authentication method, or we're going to use this particular code library, or whatever. And then they get to say, well, actually, that's not, you know, here's another library that we would prefer you to use, or whatever that is. So anyway, I think that seems to be like the biggest, you know, pain points in how we, you know, kind of identify them or whatever.
Any more questions here?
Well, just, you know, I mean, the 3 pain points that I